Hello, everyone. My name is Mikael, and I'm here with Siphiwe. This is a discussion between two writers and teachers, and we are here to share something with you. Your trilogy is called The City of Kings, and I'm not referring to Helsinki, and as I understood, you are not referring to any specific city either with that name. So can you open it up a bit, like what is a City of Kings?
Oh, okay. So my three novels, the trilogy, take place in an unnamed country, but they all take place in something called the City of Kings. Now, the City of Kings exists, but with another name, right? So it exists in Zimbabwe as the city that I live in, which is called Bulawayo. But its nickname is the City of Kings because it was started as a place, as a monarchy, like there was a monarchy, and then we got colonized, so we only had two kings, and then the British came and ended all of that. So it's known affectionately as the City of Kings. And I locate most of my novels there because I find it very illuminating to think about the world from a very small place, and to just think about how history has affected these very small places in the world, and how we are all shaped by each other, and how some place that seems so remote is actually probably very familiar once you start looking at it closely, because human beings interact mostly the same wherever they are. And so it's very important to me that it's located in this very specific place, and that the stories actually tell what I hope are stories that people in different parts of the world can connect to.
Yeah. About connecting to those stories, before we arrived here, you also said that at the same time you are writing about city, but still you are not writing about any specific city, so to say. So kind of like, what is that about? How is it connected to City of Kings?
I mean, I think I don't know, because I feel like the actual city, unless you've been there, is not a city you can know, but it's a city you can experience. And I think that's what writing gives us. So I don't expect people to physically travel to the places I write about, but I expect you to travel there in your imagination. And maybe the place that I've written about, when you actually encounter it personally and physically, will be somewhat different. And I think that's just because it's been, put through the imagination. And this is how I imagine where I live, even though I live there. So it's not a real city in the fact that if you go to the actual Bulawayo, you will experience things that are in the book. But it is a place I think we can all journey to in our imaginations, find ourselves maneuvering around, and find ourselves interacting with the people who live there. And I think for me, that's what literature does. It allows us to do that. So I travel the world just by opening a book. It doesn't mean I've physically been to this place. And it doesn't mean that when I get there, I'll see it the same way. But it does mean that I have journeyed there in some way. And I think that is the beauty of what we both do, like the writing.
Yeah, and really like literature has this sort of like power to act as a mirror as well, so to say. So while reading, for instance, the theory of flight, which was your first book in this series, I really felt like even if it's about history, it's still a place where kind of like I can fit and I can bring my own character over there, so to say. It's really interesting, kind of like to be able to share with the text that way.
And I think, again, this is why I suppose we do what we do, right? Is so that people can, you had said before this conversation that you're afraid of actual flying, right, in the plane. I'm also not a fan of flying, but I do like seeing the world. So unfortunately, in the 21st century, the way that happens mostly is through flight. But another way that happens is through books and reading and watching things and watching film and TV. And I think the arts are very critical in that ability to allow people to travel and experience and share together. And I think the one thing that we get from that is an understanding of each other that I think is usually very difficult when you're just sitting in your part of the world and watching maybe a news clip of a place. To imagine the actual lives of the people there is always difficult. But when you read a book or when you watch a film, I think they become, they get closer to you in some way and you get to understand them better as other human beings. And that's why what we do, I think, is very important.
Yeah. You mentioned I'm afraid of flying. That's probably why I also kind of asked you what does it feel to be kind of like on the move, kind of like not anywhere in any specific place. When I fly, I always write, and I don't do anything else. It's this sort of like therapeutic way for me that lets me kind of like to focus on something. And I actually think that most of my kind of like most of the poems, I'm a poet, that are dearest to me, they're kind of like this raw material has been created while flying, and really like not knowing what I write, but I developed this sort of like special relationship to that material, and then I can work with it after I get over it and kind of like in a more aware way.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing at is how writing also works for the writer, right? So for you, it is this thing that you do and you create something when you're feeling probably like emotionally not at your best. And I think that says a lot about, the other thing that writing does, which is this therapeutic part of it for the writer in many different ways, be it you working through past trauma or like very difficult future situations that you think of, or like just I think a lot of Zimbabweans do this, where we're writing about a country that is going through a lot and is a little chaotic, and you're trying to understand what's going on. And so it works for you as much as it works for the people that read it. Unlike you, I actually cannot do anything on a plane. I can't even write. I can think of stories, but I can't actually write. So you're very lucky that way, I think. Yeah.
Does it feel that Zimbabwe as a country or as a scene of literature is also on the move, like going from somewhere to some other place?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think for sure. I think there's no Zimbabwean writer who's writing right now who's not aware that they're part of something very important and interesting that is happening. I think for the first time in our history, we have a lot of different kinds of people writing. And I think diversity in the arts is extremely important. I think having different voices and different experiences is very important. And I think for the first time, Zimbabwean literature is looking like that. I think African literature is changing a lot at the time, but I think Zimbabwean literature is changing in these very particular ways. And so you have a lot of people who would not maybe have been published in Zimbabwe 20 years ago are now being published, maybe not in Zimbabwe, but in other parts of the world. And so we're having stories about the very different kinds of people who make Zimbabwe. I think when people think of Zimbabwe, or they think of African countries, they usually think of Black people, and but I think they're very diverse communities and very diverse countries, and so we have Asian and Indian and European voices that also are writing right now. And one could say European voices have always been writing, which is true, but Asian voices haven't always, and I think we're having a proliferation of that start to happen, and that's very important. Just as it's important to have people of women who are also writing more and more, but also people from, who identify very differently in terms of gender and sexuality writing. I think you just need a lot of diverse voices. And so in that sense, we're definitely moving forward as a country, as a literature, I think. And this is a good thing.
So as I understand it, it's on the other hand, it's about the diversity, but on the other hand, it's also about kind of like this diversity coming together and changing something, so to say.
Yeah, I think what we are aware of, and this is from the conversations I've had with other writers, is that we are aware of the fact that if we're not careful, this moment in our history will be remembered in very particular ways that are not necessarily reflective of how we would like them to be remembered. And so the best way to counter that is to write about how you see things or how you would like to see things. And I think in most places where you have a very top-down approach to how narratives are told, it's always important to have other people also be able to tell narratives. So I think as writers, we're very much aware that there have to be other narratives, especially about not only our past, but our present and the future that we imagine should be possible for future generations. So I don't know that we don't text each other and say, oh, this is what we're doing, but the zeitgeist just happens to be doing that at the moment. We're part of this understanding that we need different stories coming from where we come from. Yeah.
So about the background, I just learned that if we look at the timeline of past 100 years, Zimbabwe has changed its name 5 times. And then there is the colonialist history, and then there is something we could call post-colonialism. Could you open this up a bit?
Yeah. So we were officially colonized in 1890. We unofficially and unlawfully first declared independence in 1965, where we had a white minority government, and so that became Rhodesia. And then soon after that happened, we had a civil war that lasted almost 15 years. And after that civil war, we had the birth of what is now Zimbabwe since 1980. And so, we've had very different experiences during those different times. It's been a very volatile history. We've worked for a very short history for 100 years. It's been very volatile. But I think that's true of most settler colonies. So we were a settler colony. And I think that's just how settler colonies happen. And so we are very much aware, I think, as a people who've inherited this history, that there are so many stories and ways to tell what happened and what should be happening and what we would like to happen. And so I think a lot of that is coming through the writing. And I think a lot of that history is important to contend with, but it's also a history that connects us to the rest of the world. I think these ways of understanding power, of understanding how you relate to people, of understanding how you control people are things that most people in the world experience at some point in their own histories. And so it is a way to say, this is how we've experienced this. And this is what we are thinking of doing with it, which I think is what makes the literature able to travel the way it does, because people can connect on that level to that history, even though it didn't happen to them in that particular way. I think empire and colonialism, repeats itself all over the world, is currently repeating itself all over the world. And so people can connect to those things. And so when you're telling that story, unfortunately, is always a current story, unfortunately, because power loves more power, right? And so, it keeps repeating itself.
Yeah, and in your second book, The History of Man, especially, you have kind of, in a sense, put yourself into the shoes of white male colonialist in order to show that side of the story. So what sort of process has that been?
I think the one important thing there's many things, but I think the most important thing that writing does for the reader is it allows you to empathize. So you are able to enter another person's experience in a way that I think in day-to-day life we just cannot. And so it was important to me to understand the people who had created the country that I had inherited, and the sort of power struggles and all of that still happen up to today. I think a lot of people, when they think of the book, think in terms of race. Right? They think, oh, this Black woman is writing about a white man. But really, I'm just writing about my history and how my country was shaped. And I think if I'm to understand how, as Zimbabweans, we've gotten to be Zimbabweans, I have to understand what Rhodesia was and how Rhodesia created the Zimbabwe that I come to inherit. So it's important for us to all do that work, to understand others or the other, whatever that other is for you or to you. And so, it was important for me to understand how power came to play in colonialism, how a certain kind of structuring society came to play. And I couldn't do that from the perspective of a Black woman, because in the time I'm writing about, a Black woman had no such power. I don't think she has that power even today, but definitely not then. So it was important to see it from the person who creates that kind of power and benefits from that kind of power. And that's how I ended up writing the character that I ended up writing.
Yeah, and currently one of the courses you teach at the University of the Arts Helsinki, it's actually focused on character building. How do you approach characters as a writer?
Yeah, so for me, I think, characters, if you're reading a novel, are your entry point. And so, like I just said, they're essential in creating this understanding of empathy. I think that the most wonderful thing that comes from reading about another person living somewhere else is that you do get to empathize with that person. And I think empathy, at its very best, does qualitatively change us as human beings and hopefully makes us better. I think the more we understand each other, the more we understand ourselves, the more we understand each other, hopefully the world gets to be a better place because we're not so eager to find difference. We're looking for similarities. And so in the class that I teach, we talk about the importance, the fundamentals that make character in a story, and how it's important to really understand the importance of character in a story and how to use that to think through your story. Because you could also think about your story through plot, for instance. But, you can also think about it through characters and how you want to communicate certain things to the reader through your characters and how you can hone your skills in order to do that. So that's what that class does.
Yeah, really, really, really interesting. And also the other course you are teaching takes this sort of like mixed genre approach, which I would guess is also in a sense related to that idea of diversity in literature. And could you also share something about that? Would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think so for me, diversity is important on so many levels, but definitely when you're working, it's important because I think sometimes as creatives, we are siloed into what we do. So, I will admit right now, sitting across from you and you're a poet, that I don't read that much poetry, right? Because I've been trained to think in terms of prose. And so actually I sometimes struggle with poetry. And because I struggle, I'm like, oh no, I don't have to read it. I don't have to engage with it. And then when I do engage with it and I understand it, I enjoy it. But I think we sometimes get trained out of being able to read across genres and learning from different genres. So I think it's always important as writers to read. So it's important for me as a prose writer to read poetry or to engage with poetry. And I think vice versa, because I think we can learn from each other's techniques and what we use in our craft. And so the class definitely is trying to get students to do that, to sort of like get out of their comfort zone, engage with the genres that they would not normally engage with. So right now, we just finished reading a screenplay, and they're going to have to write a little bit of a screenplay. Whether they're lyrical poets or, novelists, they're all going to have to write this screenplay. And I think it's important to just do that for yourself. But you don't know, how sort of like working with maybe the way poets are so careful with language will help you as a novelist to pick your words more carefully, right? And like just sort of like be able to find the right word for what you're writing. So I think we can learn across the genres that way. But I think instead of just reading to learn, we also need to practice, because writing is practice. Praxis. So I think, it's important to also put what we read into practice. So if you read a certain genre, just try writing it. You may not be particularly good at it, but you've tried to write it. I don't think I'll ever be good at poetry, but, but it's good to engage with poetry. Yeah.
Actually, when reading your books and also reading your interviews and so on, there is one specific word that keeps appearing, or then I'm kind of very sensitive to it, but it's audacity. In in a sense of like being bold, but also being ready to kind of like break this sort of like conventions. Now, how do you see the importance of that sort of like things?
I think in the context of the novels, it's important, I think, for most of my characters to come to an understanding of themselves as people, as characters who can actually understand themselves, understand the world around them, and have enough faith in themselves to change both those things, themselves and the world around them. And so a lot of them are on that journey to self-discovery and self-understanding. But I think it's easy to say that. It takes a lot of audacity to be able to do that. It takes a whole lot of understanding and reconciling within yourself to be able to come to understand yourself as being an agent of anything, right? And so I think that work is something that perhaps here in Finland you're socialized towards, but definitely where I come from, we're not. So this is something that we have to discover for ourselves, is that we can actually effect change, and that we can, within ourselves do a lot and are capable of doing a lot. And so it's important for me to have that message, I think, in most of the books that I write, because I think it's a lesson we are not taught. And it's one that we need to not only learn, but know to be true. So I think we are in need of a lot of audacity where I come from. And I think it's an important thing to try and instill.
I really think that we have the same need as well. And one thing that kind of like interests me and excites me in poetry is that you cannot kind of like understand it in a sense. Like I feel that it also helps you to not only accept uncertainty, but also like to navigate in it, because in the end, like that's kind of like the world we are living in, kind of, and really like poetry also like it emphasizes the multiplicity of different voices and materials and so on coming together.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, because I think that has been my stumbling block. So with poetry, so I think now that you said that, I understand what it's doing a whole lot better, because I think I was trying to understand it in very specific ways. And if that's not what it's there, if it's supposed to be challenging that very notion that I can do that, then that's actually a different way to look at it. And I know your work does this a lot, and you make people encounter your work in very different ways in different spaces. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like in a sense you cannot grasp the kind of like essence of a certain poem unless you also read other poems. So it's this sort of like comparative sensitivity that it kind of like develops, something like this.
Nice.
Yeah. But overall, about sharing literature, sharing ideas and practices, I understand you have had most of your education on the States, and could you say something about the meaning of the education and why did you still end up back in Zimbabwe as a writer?
Oh, as a writer. Yes. So to contextualize, when I left home the first time, Zimbabwe was still in its golden years. So I just assumed I'd go home after undergrad. And then things changed. And then I found myself not quite able to go home. And so I decided to, again, get to understand myself. And so I stayed in the States, and I got different degrees, ended up with a PhD, fully understanding that I was going to become a professor and teach. But I always loved to write. I've loved stories since I was a child. I've loved to read since I was a child, and I've loved to write since I was a child. So I always wanted to write. And I always wanted to write about where I came from, in some way. And so when the time came, at some point, I think I was walking in Boston, and it had just snowed quite a lot, which I'm sure you all can hear.
Like today?
Like today, yes. And I remember walking, and my leg just went through this whole heap of snow, and I thought, no, not anymore. I don't want this anymore. I come from sunshine. I come from elephant grass. I'll go back to where I come from. And I decided to move back home. And it's been very instrumental for me to actually write about where I live while I live in it, because I think it just makes me more keenly aware as a writer about what I'm writing about. My first book I wrote mostly when I was in the States. The subsequent novels I've written while I was at home. And I think it does change things when you're actually breathing and living what you're writing, instead of thinking about it and being, philosophical or intellectual. But when you're actually living it, I think it does add a different texture to your work. And so, yeah, I've enjoyed being back home and writing, and I think it has helped me in many ways be the kind of writer that I am today, to be in Zimbabwe while I write.
Oh, and you do write in English, the same way as most of the writers that you were referring to earlier. And then again, like as a very, very small language, we are so proud of writing in Finnish, and we want to help to keep the language alive against English and so on. Can you say something about that? Why are people maybe writing in English?
The answer is simple. We were colonized, right, to write in English, to communicate primarily in English. But I think just in terms of audience, I think also for a lot of us coming from where we come from, maybe in Finland things are different. I don't know, but maybe you have a very strong and robust translation culture. Where, if you write in Finnish, you'll get translated into Swedish and English and da-da-da and da-da-da and da-da-da. We don't have such a thing. So if I write in a very small African language, the people who read that small African language will read it, but very few people will read it beyond that, because we just don't have a strong translation culture. And this question that you ask is one that has been part of a lot of debates within African literature. We have a famous debate between Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o about what language should African literature be written in. And a lot of people feel strongly that it should be written in African languages. And Chinua Achebe said, I inherit this language that gives me access to most of the world. I will write in that language. I will speak the other language. I will do whatever else in the language. But to communicate, if writing is about communication, then I may as well do it to the biggest audience possible. So I think that kind of tension is always there. But I think we have writers who write in these languages, a lot of them, you will never know them because they will never be translated into a language that you have access to. And that's the downside, right? And so the reason I'm sitting here is because I wrote in English. That's the trueness of it. If I had written in my mother tongue, I would not be sitting here because it would not have traveled the same way. And that is not to say that one literature is better than the other one. It just has to say a lot about marketing, money, and publishing, and those things coming together to value one language over another.
Finally, maybe I would like to know more about this sort of movement that is going on in the Zimbabwean literature. Do you feel that you are writing this sort of like counter narratives to some narratives that have been very stuck into the culture?
My thought is that Zimbabwean literature has a history of being a counter-narrative in and of itself. So we have very the state wants to control the narrative about what the country is. And since 1979, with a very particular book from a very particular author, which we all think is the birth of what is current Zimbabwean literature, we've had a counter-narrative to that state narrative. And so if you remember in the beginning, I was talking about how the beauty of having the diversity is that you get to tell stories from different perspectives. And so I think part of what we're doing is breaking up that narrative, that's a top-down narrative that says this is what Zimbabwe is, and saying actually Zimbabwe is diverse. Zimbabwe is all these other things. Zimbabwe has this other type of history that is not just about colonial rule, but about people coming for different reasons, finding themselves in Zimbabwe. There's a wonderful book that came out last year written by an Indian woman who doesn't want to be called an Indian woman because she's a Zimbabwean, and so she sees herself as Zimbabwean Asian. And she grew up there, and she wants her story to be told like that. And I know that in your parts of the world, you have people who have come here and settled who want their stories to be told too, right? Who are not necessarily Finnish or European, but feel like they're now part of the fabric of your society and want their voices to be told too. And that's just fair, right? And it's just how literature should be, or the arts should be. And so I think when you have this very top-down way of thinking about things, it's always important for other people to say, well, actually, that's not it, right? We all here, this is a history that was created by us, and we are the ones in charge of the story, not the state. And that's what I think Zimbabwean literature is doing right now. Yeah.
Thank you for the interview, Siphiwe.
Thank you.